We should be getting starting fairly soon. But again, last bit of housekeeping. This is the very last of our Anatolian Studies virtual seminar series for the year of 2020. We are going out on a high note. We will be exploring the representations of the Emperor Caracalla with Dr. Dario Calomino, who is a research fellow at Warwick University in the UK. He is a member of the project team, which deals with materiality and meaning in Greek festival culture of the Roman imperial period. But he is also a member of the Roman Provincial Coinage Project. So he has many different hats. Prior to that, he worked for many years at the British Museum. And he's kind of bringing together some of that numismatic experience with some other cultic things as well in tonight's lecture. It's the last of the year, and I do think I just want to say for a moment, it has been a fantastic year, and I've been looking forward to this, especially because it's visually a wonderful talk. It's a wonderful paper. If you haven't read it already, online or in your hard copy of the journal. I think Dario has some questions about the pictures he's been able to show, but I will let Dario mention those in due course. Let's welcome Dario for your lecture.
Thank you very much. So shall I start sharing my screen from now? Yes. There you go. So again, a good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Nasia, for having me today. And of course, many thanks indeed to the British Institute of Ankara for inviting me to discuss my paper in the Anatolian Studies on Caracalla and the Divine. So, today I will present what I believe are the main points of my article, which discusses the visual language adopted in the cities of Asia Minor to represent the Emperor Caracalla in the years 214 to 217 AD, of course, which is spent traveling between the Anatolian region, Egypt, and the Near East. The focus of this study is the imagery designed to express his relation with the divine through the overlapping representations of the emperor as a devotee and peer of the gods and as a divine being. Therefore, my analysis is not based on new archaeological finds, but it is a broader discussion on the interpretation of some very rare or unique coins from public and private collections, which are represented here all together for the first time. And as Nasia was mentioning, I should also point out that due to copyright reason, because this will be on the YouTube and online, it will not be possible to show in this PowerPoint some of the specimens that are published in the article. However, when possible, I have replaced them with similar ones from auctions. And so there will be lots of coins, as I mentioned before, and I hope this is something that will entertain you and not bore you too much. So why Caracalla and the Divine? First, I should like to stress that even though we do not have exact figures to rely on, the Roman provincial coinage of Caracalla was probably the largest in scale among those produced in the 3 centuries of activity of provincial mints, ranging from Augustus to Diocletian. The standard reference to approach the study of these materials is the Roman Provincial Coinage Project online database, which is curated by the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, which you can see the homepage here, which is constantly kept up to date, including volumes already published and ones which are still in progress. You can see a short breakdown on the side of the screen to see how it is progressing. And volume 5, which includes the Severan family, is indeed still in progress, but a rough estimate based on current provisional numbers certainly suggests that the reign of Caracalla saw the highest volume of production in proportion to the short duration of only 7 years of his reign, from AD 211 to 217. This makes the range of materials that we can consider extremely rich and diverse. But my interest in the coinages of Caracalla from Asia Minor originates from the fact that a number of cities celebrated him with great emphasis and originality while he was staying in the region, and that the most prominent characteristic of the way in which Roman imperial power was interpreted on local media in this period is indeed his relation with the divine. In this respect, this was an extremely creative period, and while some of these designs influenced the visual language adopted to interpret Roman imperial power under his successors, other ones document the introduction of completely new and unique ways of communicating this message, which were abandoned soon after Caracalla's death and never resumed. This is especially the case with the peculiar imagery shared by a small group of cities in southern Anatolia, which are indicated in this map. In the provinces of Pisidia, Pamphylia, and Cilicia, which issued their coinages for Caracalla probably in around AD 215. And these coinages depicted scenes of worship of the image of Caracalla in the presence of the civic gods. So this will be the main focus of the paper, which I will discuss in the second part. However, in order to better contextualize the genesis of this extraordinary imagery on which I will focus, it is important to look also at other examples of how Caracalla was acclaimed on local coinage. In the first part of his journey, in the northern and central regions of Anatolia, where we can already appreciate that his passage was commemorated by the local elites with unprecedented wealth of resources and creativity. Caracalla probably wintered in, so this is a rough reconstruction of Caracalla's path. Caracalla probably wintered in Nicomedia at the end of 213, when then visited the Danubian regions in the first month of 214, before crossing the Hellespont again for the last time. After visiting Ilium, which you can see here, the imperial journey stopped for sure at Pergamon, Thyatira, and Laodicea at Lycum. And towards the end of 214, Caracalla quartered in Nicomedia for the second time until April 215. Then the itinerary from Nicomedia to Antioch, where he arrived before the end of the same year, probably touched Teana and Tarsus in Cilicia. Once in Antioch, he left for a few months to visit Alexandria between the end of 215 and the beginning of 216, and then again possibly in the autumn before heading to Mesopotamia and Osroene on the Parthian front, where he wintered at Edessa until spring 217, where he eventually died. A reference study published by Anne Johnston in 1983 first warned about the danger of interpreting the depictions of the emperor on the reverse of local coins as necessary evidence for an actual imperial visit to the city. While most of them only commemorated the grant of imperial benefits or privileges to a community, or simply hailed the emperor. So despite the unusual number of cities where he was acclaimed on civic coinage, only few episodes can be definitely connected to an imperial visit. 3 Asia Minor cities stand out for their extraordinary production of coinage in his name, mostly large bronze medallions, which we will see shortly. And they all introduced new designs emphasizing Caracalla's special bond with local gods and his qualities as a divine emperor. These are Pergamon in Mysia, Laodicea in Phrygia, and Tarsus in Cilicia. So 3 of the cities that we have already marked in the map. And the best known example is Pergamon. The city issued a long series of bronze medallions, of which you can see only a very small sample here, that celebrated the visit of Caracalla to the famous sanctuary of Asclepius, to whom he was greatly devoted, as it is extensively recounted in the words of, among others, Cassius Dio and Herodian. These bronzes were conceived as a sequence of pictures illustrating the different moments of his visit, basically like an official report of a state visit, from his arrival to the performing of rites and sacrifices, to the encounter with Asclepius in person, or at least this is how it is presented on coinage, as we can see in the last specimen to the far right. All these images show Caracalla liaising with the local deities as they appear. He's greeted by the city personification, who presents him with a small statue of Asclepius upon his arrival, and then he stands in front of a life-size image of the god himself. And some of these designs, particularly the one that I've just mentioned, the ones of the Adventus, where he's being greeted by the Tyche of Pergamon while holding a small statue of Asclepius, set a precedent and became a pattern adopted also in other cities. At Thyatira in Lydia, for instance, which Caracalla probably visited immediately after Pergamon, we find exactly the same iconography to commemorate the event, except the Tyche greets the emperor while holding a statue of its own protecting god, which is Apollo Tyrrhenius. Then, after this lavish celebration on local coins of Pergamon, the next stop of the imperial journey was Laodicea, where the iconography of Caracalla's visit was even more groundbreaking to some extent. A series of medallions showed him in realistic scenes set firmly within the civic landscape, like the two that we are looking here. In one, he performs a sacrifice in front of a temple surrounded by togaed figures and cult officiants. And in the other one, of which we see only the reverse, he stands surrounded by a crowd of togaed figures and soldiers within a colonnade square, also closed by a temple on the short side behind his back. In both, he is acclaimed as the emperor, but he is also worshipped as a demigod, just incorporated into the local pantheon, because just as Pergamon, also Laodicea was honored with the privilege to be Neokoros of his cult, which is to host a temple for the provincial cult of Caracalla. And this might be what these two designs celebrate in a more realistic fashion. But then another series of medallions minted by the city under the same magistrate depicted the triumphal procession of the emperor, ideally across the city, but this time elusively presenting him as a new god. This is another sequence of 3 pictures, each featuring Caracalla driving a quadriga. One is dragged by elephants, one by panthers, and the third by centaurs. They all allude to the triumph of Dionysus and more or less explicitly assimilate the image of the emperor with that of a Neos Dionysus, or at least especially the third one, which obviously features mythological creatures, while the other two may refer to actual parade of wild beasts across the city. And finally, another impressive medallion completed this cycle, depicting a scene of emperor worship entirely framed into a mythical setting. This is the personification of Gaia and Thalassa, the land and the sea. They hold together a full figure standing statue of Caracalla in a military dress. The emperor is therefore not only introduced among the gods as one of them, but he is literally presented to the community by them. This imagery reflects the habit of acclaiming the emperor as a master of the land and sea, which became a particularly popular formula in inscriptions of the Severan age. And the use of this trope to represent an emperor is only attested once before in the visual culture of Roman Asia Minor, in the Julio-Claudian Sebastian of Aphrodisias, which we can see a panel to the right, where Claudius plays exactly the same role, standing among the allegories of land and sea. This imagery from Laodicea documents another example of influence from a Pergamene iconography, because with regards to coinage, there was a precedent in Pergamon again. This was first introduced under Commodus and continued indeed under Caracalla. But as we can see, there is a slight difference in the way in which the terms of the metaphor is presented. In the medallion of Commodus, we have a representation of God, Zeus, standing again between the two personifications. And in the medallion of Caracalla at Pergamon, the two figures hold together a nude standing male figure holding a thunderbolt. So this is Zeus, who may be ambiguously assimilated to Caracalla. But we can see that at Laodicea, we get to the next step, and where we are definitely presented with a cult statue of the emperor in flesh, being consecrated by the gods. And the last stop of Caracalla, where his visit was lavishly celebrated on coinage in bronze and exceptionally even in silver, as we can see in the slide, again by stressing his divine prerogatives, was Tarsus in Cilicia, where we might be in AD 215. The inscriptions on coins document that the city was blessed with special gifts, particularly of grain from Egypt, and as on this coin showing Gale and the word Sitos. But also other coin designs attest that the Caracalla also gifted the city with probably funding in money, and gave them imperial festivals to celebrate. And Caracalla was also portrayed on the obverse of many of these issues, as we can see, we will be able to see later, with the garments of a honorary demiurgus of the city, a higher rank officer, and at the same time a patron of the gods, whereas here we can see the ceremony in which Demiurgeia, the personification, is crowning him with bestowing the honor upon him. And here we see two images of Caracalla in the robes of the demiurgus with this characteristic crown. At the same time, these issues show that he was again depicted in the moment of his adventus, like in Pergamon and in Thyatira, while being greeted by the Tike of the city, who present him with the crown of Demiurgus again. And also, he was represented as a priest performing rites and animal sacrifice, again, just like in Pergamon. So this time he featured as an emperor, but also as a magistrate, as a priest or pontifex, and of course, as a divine being. And this aspect, the divine, was actually brought to a brand new dimension in the coinage of Tarsus. And this is how we get to the very core of the issues that I want to discuss. A new imagery was introduced expressly to honor him, which emphasized the divine character of his power by presenting his cult image being worshipped by the gods. In two issues, we find this new trope, and this is one representing Apollo Patros with his chlamys and quiver, holding the bust of Caracalla in one hand and contemplating it. And then in another issue, the same bust of Caracalla is held by two divine patrons of the city together, Heracles and Perseus, the mythical founder of Tarsus. As mentioned before, there is no precedent to this imagery, but of course one can possibly see a direct line from the imagery of Laodicea, where the idea of depicting the imperial cult statue being displayed in the presence of divine allegories made its first appearance. Simon Price first suggested that this may be an iconography associated with rituals of imperial mysteries, centered around the unveiling and adoration of the imperial image by his followers. The evidence is too poor, unfortunately, to support this assumption, but there could be a connection with the imagery of Caracalla at Tarsus that rests also into the realm of imperial mysteries. Sorry. So the imperial donation of grain to the city was an opportunity to assimilate Caracalla to Triptolemus, the mythical inventor of corn growing, traditionally an alter ego of Ptolemaic kings addressed in mystery initiation rites in Egypt. Two civic issues celebrated Caracalla's connection with Triptolemus in parallel. On one, to the left, he is driving a biga of serpents in his military attire, while sowing grain seeds from a bag. And in the other one, we find Triptolemus himself taking his place or vice versa, which implies a complete symbiosis between the god and the emperor. So this might be a clue of a possible mysteric cult in Tarsus associated with Caracalla. However, the display of imperial statues in processions was also a normal practice at imperial festivals. So the imagery of Tarsus may simply reflect a festival ceremony held in Caracalla's honor, so much so that the festivals were deliberately named Antoniniana for him. So that would make perfect sense. Anyway, moving on, while the imagery focused on the worship of Caracalla's images was probably introduced at Tarsus due to the special bond between the community and the emperor, it became a visual pattern that influenced other communities as well, where it was copied or emulated. And the most prominent of these communities is certainly Side in Pamphylia. There is no special reason to believe that Caracalla may have visited the city in person, and yet a series of bronze issues adapted the pattern from Tarsus to convey the same message associated with the worship of Caracalla's image. On coins of Caracalla and Julia Domna, here we see the coin of Caracalla and the reverse of the coin of Julia Domna. We find this time Athena, the chief patron of the city, seated on throne while holding a bust of the emperor in one hand and contemplating it in the same attitude that we saw for the previous gods at Tarsus. Then another two bronze medallions, both known in only one specimen each, show a new variation on this theme. A god of the city stands in front of a small altar, on top of which a colossal cuirassed bust of Caracalla seems to be floating, almost like a divine epiphania. And this scene that we can see on this coin, it is the Tyche of the city probably, standing before the bust and next to a military standard. Then we have another specimen in the Boston Museum of Fine Art collection, where we find a male armored figure, arguably Ares, in exactly the same posture. In both images, the god appears to be caught in adoration, gazing at Caracalla's sacred image. So there is a clue to a possible interpretation of these images which has been put forward by Nollet. If we go back to this coin of Side to the right, we see that in the exergue, there is the image of a ship, which may indicate the arrival of the cult image by the sea, then being acclaimed by the community and brought in procession into the temple. But this may also simply refer to the imperial journey across the region, if not to an imperial visit to the city itself. So there is no particular reason to force one interpretation or the other to me. What seems to connect all these images together, anyway, is the celebration of Caracalla's military achievement, the military character of both these images, perhaps his preparation for the Parthian campaign, and the way in which it is linked to the worship of his sacred icons, perhaps by the city, perhaps by the soldiers. And there is also additional evidence from two Pisidian cities, Sergei and Sagalassus. Both may have worshipped the emperor in one or more of their temples, but it is unlikely that the emperor visited either. Still, the same visual pattern is attested at Sergei, which had a very small coin production compared to Side and especially Tarsus. A unique coin in the National Museum of Palazzo Massimo in Rome, of which I am presenting here a sketch in this slide for reason mentioned above, presents a scene, again, with two gods standing in adoration of Caracalla's bust. This is a radiate bust, as you can probably guess from my drawing. An iconography that seems to be particularly close to that of Tarsus, because once once again, we have Dionysus, one of the gods who seems to be holding the heavy and large bust in one hand. And on the other side, we find Nike crowning him from behind, which is also a further allusion to the military framework in which this imagery seems to be contextualized in between Side and Serge. And lastly, we have two examples from Sagalassus, when we are faced with another variation to the pattern that prevailed in the other cities. A colossal bust of Caracalla is framed within an octastyle temple. This imagery breaks the direct connection between the imperial image and the city's deities, but it still rests firmly into the realm of imperial worship, centered on a cult image inside a cult building. In this specimen of Giulia Donna, you can see much better on the reverse the bust of Caracalla with its very neat and immediately recognizable profile. So both designs, again, are completely unique. In my opinion, probably coming from, as a derivation from this pattern. But there is only one exception, which I would like to mention just to have an idea of how rare this type of depiction is. We do not have much images of possibly cult images of the emperor within a temple on provincial coins, and this is the precedent under Augustus and the city of Teos, whereas we do not know whether the head of Augustus within the temple simply signifies that the temple was dedicated to him, or it alluded to the fact that there was a cult statue inside. Anyway, this and the examples from Sagalassus are the only ones that we know in the whole provincial coins production. Yes. So, as we can see, as we have seen, overall, each one of these designs is either a unicum or incredibly rare in the repertoire of provincial mints, and they were never used again by any other cities after the death of Caracalla. This suggests that this visual language was designed for him and tailored to his distinctive characteristics. Then how do we explain that more than one city adopted the same iconography at the same time and exclusively for him? There was certainly a strong element of emulation, mutual emulation, probably towards the models introduced by the most prominent and influential community, such as Tarsus in southern Anatolia, and it was certainly the case also with the imagery created at Pergamon in the north. But I also believe that there could be more to it. The fact that these tropes were invented in the time when Caracalla resided in the area can be a clue, even though the choice of coin designs and legends in the provinces, as well as the very decision to produce coinage at all on a local basis, depended entirely on the civic administration's authority rather than on central control. I think we can also consider the possibility that in exceptional circumstances, unusual and, so to say, personalized designs, such as the ones adopted for Caracalla, were inspired by the ways in which Caracalla and his entourage wanted him to be honored during his visits. I would not view these as resulting from imperial interference, but as simply as a response to exceptional events that affected local communities more directly than in normal circumstances. A precedent, and I'm going to conclude, a precedent can be found in the also unparalleled experience of defacement of Gaeta's image on Asian Minor coins after his Damnatio Memoriae, which was extensive in a number of cities of Asia Minor, unlike any other of the damned predecessors or successors. And this can probably be put in connection with Caracalla's visit again in the following years. The coins might have been erased and defaced either in preparation for his visit or afterwards. The exact chronology is hard to define. But there I too believe that we can see possible consequences of the fact that Caracalla governed the empire from these regions and of the way he engaged and he interacted with the local communities during this time. After all, we can also appreciate the impact of Caracalla's rule from abroad in the way it was communicated in Rome on imperial state media. His visit to the sanctuary of Asclepius in Pergamon was exceptionally commemorated on Roman Ori in his absence, as we can see from this beautiful specimen. This was issued in 215, almost certainly after the first series of local bronze medallions had been released. And here also we find a very daring iconography showing the emperor almost touching the god, and the god almost coming out the temple to greet him, something that we finds little or no parallels in the imperial iconography at all. So the parallel with the coinage of Pergamon, celebrating on a local basis the visit, is very compelling. And this can be almost interpreted as if the visual culture of the provincial community had influenced contemporary metropolitan media rather than the other way around. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Dario. That was visually stimulating as well as intellectually stimulating. I love looking at these intricate images, and there's so much to discuss about each and every one. We have a question already in the Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box and I will read them to Dario. We have one already from Luca Mazzini, who says, "Thank you for the brilliant presentation. I would like to ask if we could see an association of Caracalla with Alexander the Great in the issues with the quadriga of elephants. More specifically, if we have Hellenistic issues with a similar iconography related to Alexander or another Hellenistic dynasty."
Okay, Luca, thank you very much for the question. We definitely can. And there has been discussion, of course, when we see this sort of, when we talk about Caracalla, Alexander the Great is always the first reference that comes to mind. And although I find that sometimes this has been overstated and there's been a tendency towards trying to see references to Alexander the Great a little bit everywhere, the reference to the elephants is definitely one. Of course, this merges the image of Alexander the Great with that of Dionysus in the Triumph of Dionysus. And there has been work, especially by Ziegler, who has analyzed and discussed this aspect. So the answer is yes to me. And it is always hard to work out whether it's one element of emulation that prevails rather than the other. I think in this case, because in this particular case of Laodicea, it comes as a triptych of a sequence of 3 images in which we also find panthers and centaurs. It is to some extent a more global and holistic interpretation of the divine in relation to the image of Caracalla, which embraces also, which goes beyond in some way. But the idea of Alexander the Great is definitely there.
We have a number. I have a question almost on that point, but I'll come back to it because we already have questions piling up in the box. Jemre asks, generally, emperors' images are depicted as smaller than the gods and divine creatures. In some images, such as Ares and Caracalla's bust, probably it was from Cide, Caracalla's bust seems bigger than Ares. What can we interpret from this?
Yes. So this has always been considered as a sort of conventional way of ranking emperors as compared to gods, particularly in imperial coinage, metropolitan coinage. We find the first examples of direct association between Zeus and the emperor, where in the 2nd century AD, where Zeus is much bigger than the emperor. In this case, it is very hard to say whether the difference between the images of Athena holding a small bust, a portable bust in one hand, can be seen as a different way of interpreting the divine as compared with the colossal bust of Caracalla in the other medallions, where, as you rightly point out, it is larger than life and larger, even larger than the gods. I do not think that, simply because it is in the same coinage and in contemporary issues, I do not think that we can infer anything in particular. I think it is simply a different way of presenting the divine. In one case, probably there is more emphasis on how, as I said, the divine can be expressed in a bigger size than humans, and in this case, the fact that it's bigger than the gods himself, to me, is definitely interesting.
Fantastic. Ken Frank asks, we have two questions actually that I think can come together. Ken Frank asks, how do we distinguish between a medallion and a coin from this period? And Isabella Sjöström asks whether any of these medallions or coins are on display in the Pergamon Museum, and both of them found the talk very interesting and said thank you.
Thank you both. So the first question is really a question of technical terminology that is entirely invented. It is entirely a modern or contemporary convention, because we do not have this sort of differentiation, particularly in provincial coinage. Of course, in imperial coinage, it is a different thing, because we can clearly tell apart medallions from currency. In provincial coinage, it is much harder, because the range of denominations is very different from the ones that we have in imperial coinage. We have much larger and heavier denominations, exceeding the size and the weight of the sestertius, which is the largest denomination in imperial coinage. And so even the term medallions may not be entirely appropriate. Some scholars have called them presentation pieces or prestige pieces. Personally, the way I make a distinction is when they exceed a certain size. So especially when they're heavier than 35, 40 grams, then it seems to be definitely something bigger and quite extraordinary for being used as normal currency. Then, of course, we have to take into account the fact that the later issues in the half of the century were lighter than these, but featured denomination values, denomination marks on the obverse, which indicated that these pieces were worth even 10 or 11 asses compared to the Roman ass in Rome. So again, two completely different standards, which cannot be easily fit together. The second question, I'm afraid I'm not able to answer, because I have not been sadly, I have not been in Pergamon for many years. And honestly, I do not recall if there is. But of course, in the Pergamon Museum, there is the amazing stone head of Caracalla, which I used in the article, which was associated with a statue and a dedication to Caracalla, in which he is veiled, which I find very, very interesting.
If anybody manages to get to the museum in Bergamo, maybe you can let us know.
Yes, that would be.
Samuel Reinekainen says, thank you for the interesting presentation. I was wondering, what methods are there for linking religious and historical figures to the figures depicted on coins? Also, how does one differentiate between intentional defacing of coins and natural wear and tear?
Oh, okay. I'm not quite sure I get the first question. The second is fairly straightforward. The first one, sorry, can you show it again, or is it gone?
Yes, how do we identify the figures on coins as religious or historical figures? How do we know who it is?
Well, of course, if we are talking about I mean, we look at attributes, just like for statues or paintings or mosaics. There are very well-defined attributes which are part of an established visual language that to some extent encompassed all media. And so it is fairly easier to identify gods and emperors. Normally, in the vast majority of cases, were presented in a military attire. But of course, the way in which sometimes they played with this ambiguity is the interesting bit. So when we do find an image of an emperor nude, but partly holding some attributes and partly holding attributes of an emperor, then of course we see that this interplay becomes particularly stimulating. I'm not sure whether this answers the question. And the extent to which we can distinguish between intentional defacement and coin wear sometimes is very hard to define. Many times, well, first of all, we have to stress that it is very rare that we find intentional defacement on coins, particularly on imperial coins, and in those cases we often may be mistaken between a scratch which hit the face of the emperor or an intentional damage. For the example of Geta in Asia Minor, we do have the systematic erasure of his image, particularly on the coins where he's represented facing his brother Caracalla, as if the two could not stand together on the same image. And the image and the bust of Geta was accurately chiseled off. So that is definitely, of course, a result of intentional defacement.
Okay, the questions are pouring in now. Just
yes,
on that,
I probably
I think
need
it might be worth
to be quicker. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what might be worth noting as well, especially with local civic coinages such as Anatolia, when you know a city is associated with a particular god, it's more likely that that's the god that, you know, so you know Pergamon, there's the Asclepion, at Colophon there's Apollo Clarios, so a number of that also helps. Right, to get on to some more of the questions, we have a question from an anonymous attendee who says, the images of Caracalla seem very similar to the statues and busts of him. Does this provide good evidence of his actual likeness, or just an emperor's decree of how he would like to look?
Very interesting questions indeed. Well, there would be a very long discussion to make about this. Let's say that as compared to other emperors, the portrait of Caracalla was particularly distinctive in the way in which it broke with the portrait fashion of previous emperors. To say it in few words, the philosopher type of emperor that was embodied until basically his immediate predecessor, even Septimus Severus, his father. And then he introduced, arguably upon his own, obviously, mandate, this completely new type with short beard, which is said to be embodying the soldier emperor, but in fact may also be an image of a heroic image, possibly of a demigod itself. So this is, I think, the reason why they look alike so much, because it's so distinctively recognizable.
Okay, I know there's lots of questions, but can I just jump in there with something that has been bothering me? Of course, so we know, you've said as well in your article that Caracalla's image is of the Soldatenkaiser, right? He's the soldier emperor. And so, but why does he choose to change it? Why is this sudden decision, this, now I'm going to visit Asia Minor, I'm going to change my image, I'm going to, you know, get my haircut. It sounds like a deliberate, but why? I'm really interested into why this and why now?
Well, there is no practical answer to that, obviously. Unfortunately, we have to rely mostly on the accounts of contemporary authors who talk about his passion for the military life, for training like a soldier, which again has been probably overemphasized in the past literature. And then more recently, this image of the soldier and emperor as the, the archetype of the soldier emperor has been to some extent blended, and new studies have interpreted more the idea that a different typology of image could be presented specifically for the Eastern audiences who were more maybe keen to accept the idea of an emperor with semi-divine prerogatives. But of course, this is not only very hard to demonstrate, I mean, to demonstrate for all the examples, but then even harder to justify and to explain.
Yeah, I think actually it ties into some of the questions. I'm going to start taking some of these questions together when they're thematically linked now. But actually, David Taylor's question and Petya Andreeva's questions about the the local nature of these representations link into what you've just been saying here. This is something specific to Anatolia. This is something specific to local cities. And David says, could this be more of a local initiative? Is it more bottom up rather than top down? And Petya is suggesting maybe are there certain types of images very geographical, localized, or would they be recognized in other cities? Is there anything very specific in the architectural images that can be attributed specifically to specific places with the imperial cult?
Well, not so. Shall I start? Well, let's talk about the idea of local initiative first. As I briefly mentioned, a local initiative was the rule by all means. And so in the vast majority of examples, we have coinage that reflects the choices of local elites, and it is an expression of their obviously interests, and but it is also an expression of the way they interpreted imperial power and imperial imagery. So there is again an interplay in which there may be obviously infiltration from metropolitan imagery, which obviously come up particularly when there is a celebration of a military victory or a triumph, in which obviously they draw upon imperial imagery extensively. In this particular case, though, I'm not arguing that this kind of pattern was defined centrally, not at all. It was developed locally, but because the emperor was there. So it is, I know it can be very controversial as an interpretation, but the fact that we find this exceptional imagery exclusively for Caracalla and specifically in this region has to be connected, in my opinion, with his presence. And the way in which it originated, obviously, is something that we can only speculate on. But I believe that there is a direct connection. And to answer the second question, we do, of course, find some specific connotation that can be geographically contextualized in the depiction of the gods, which obviously we find also in the rest of the production of a specific city, and then, of course, gives a local character to the depiction of the gods. With regards to the buildings, not quite, at least not the examples that I have showed in with regards to Laodicea. One is a front of a temple, which may in fact copy an imperial type. The other one is completely unprecedented. This kind of a bird eye view is something completely new and extremely daring. So again, seems something created for the purpose, and obviously it is impossible to recognize in an existing place.
Okay, from the geographical specificity to chronological specificity, we have questions from Yanessa and Aisha about what happens after Caracalla's death. Yanessa is asking that there are no specimens of this iconography after his death, but is that only the iconography of Caracalla, or do these similar kinds of compositions get used for other emperors? And Aisha says, does it get interpreted either in Asia, does it get reused, this iconography, either in Asia Minor or in Rome?
No, no. This is why it is so peculiar and so unique. There is nothing like that. We do have later images of a god. I recall the coinage of Cremna, for instance, in Pisidia, where the Tika holds, the god holds a bust, which some have interpreted as the small bust of an emperor, but not necessarily the case. And there are also some examples, I think, in Phoenicia, in the Levant. But this is an iconography that has more to do with the local traditions, local cults, and we can only speculate on the possibility that this was an emperor. But the bust in these depictions is very small, has no specific connotations, absolutely nothing quite like what we have here, where, as mentioned before, there is no doubt that this is the bust of Caracalla with his specific portrait, his very distinctive portrait.
Great, thank you. Valentin Victor Botez apologizes because he thinks his internet signal might have dropped, but he just wanted to clarify why Caracalla was associated with Triptolemus and why they switched places in the trend.
Well, he's identified with Triptolemus because he made a donation of grain, which is to the city from Egypt, which is attested in the coin inscriptions. And so the immediate divine counterpart reference for this was Triptolemus, the god who invented mythologically, the mythical being who invented the corn growing and was particularly popular in Egypt itself. So it was a very fitting parallel. And what is peculiar about the fact that the same imagery was adopted on two parallel issues, one showing clearly Caracalla, again with the portrait visible and in the military attire, and the other one in which we find a different posture, a different attributes, which seems to belong to Triptolemus. I believe it is deliberately aimed at blending the identity of the two together, of making them equal in somehow.
Fantastic. We're going to come back again to the theme of geographical specificity and why this is so peculiar to Anatolia. And Susan Walker has a comment rather than a question where she's saying this is about the Hellenistic East in general. She says the iconography of the coins from Laodicea showing Caracalla in a quadriga recalls quasi-divine images of late Hellenistic kingship in the Roman East and East Mediterranean context, especially the triumphal Octavian as portrayed in the monumental altar at Nicopolis in Greece, and on gems referencing the Battle of Actium. The same iconography of the triumphal king can be seen on the later monument of Philopappos in Athens, she suggests. But
thank you very much. Yeah.
Can we also turn for a moment to a group of questions which deal not with the East, but rather with the West? Kieran Johns asks whether there is any similar practices, perhaps in the Western part of the empire. If Caracalla traveled through Germany, can we see anything happening here? We also have Christina Alexandrescu also asks about a manifestation of Western provinces. So again, I think that's a similar question. And David Lee is interested about the circulation of some of these Eastern coins. Do any of these Eastern coins make it as far as the Roman province of Britannia?
Okay. Right. So, well, the problem with the West is, of course, that we do not have local coinages being minted. So there cannot be a direct parallel in this respect. We can look at other visual media, but as we all know, the survival rate of anything other than coins is sadly, but also luckily for a numismatist, much lower, incredibly lower. So honestly, I cannot recall anything that can be compared. And again, I believe this is the cultural framework in which this makes sense is the East rather than the West, for sure. And I'm afraid I have not dig that deep into my research as to look at potential matches between statues of Caracalla and coins. Aside from the fact that in that regard, I mean, I think it would probably make more sense to look at the dedications on inscriptions and the way in which the emperor is addressed on coin inscriptions, rather than looking at a potential parallel in visual terms. I have looked, of course, into some of the places where these coins were produced. So, for example, at Sagalassus, there are at least 2 dedications to Caracalla, and of course, at Tarsus as well. Pergamon, Caracalla was probably also addressed as Neos Dionysus, which is, of course, is a fitting reference for what we have discussed, but I have not dealt with this systematically and much into detail.
Okay, fantastic. We also have 2 questions which raise the issue of economics. Robin LeBlanc asks about denominations. How much of this imagery appears on smaller local denominations, or are they mostly on larger denominations? Do you think this is a matter of design or intended audience? And Stephen Mitchell says, should we be looking for economic explanations for any or all of these bronze coin issues? Or can they simply be an end in themselves, a way of showing the subject's enthusiasm for the emperor, orchestrated maybe by people close to Caracalla?
These kind of designs feature mainly on large denominations. Smaller denominations are much more plain, and if I have to try to recall, there are much less depictions of the emperor as a whole in smaller coins. There might be a long discussion about this, because sometimes the imagery within the coinage of a certain city was differentiated. The designs were differentiated also to mark the difference between smaller, medium, and larger denominations. And normally, if there is any sort of hierarchy, then the emperor goes in the larger ones, and the so-called pseudo-autonomous coins, so the ones that do not feature the emperor at all, even on the obverse, but have an image of a god on the obverse, mostly tend to be in the lower denominations. But again, this is not a rule, and because we do have also large medallions featuring beautiful images of the gods on the obverse. It might be, to some extent, a problem, an issue with rather than with the audience of these images, with the function of this coin, because obviously we can assume, and this probably gets into the second question, we can assume that larger medallions, again, produced on a smaller scale, and for special circumstances, were aimed at specific events. We always think about distributions, festivals, but we do not have archaeological evidence to prove that. We can only speculate. And in this respect, of course, I do believe, as I mentioned before, that when I talk about the presence of Caracalla having an impact on the decisions of the local elites, I do not mean necessarily him in person, but I'm talking about the entourage, the imperial court traveling with him, if we can use a late antique image for that. So an aspect that I have not mentioned is the names of the magistrates mentioned on these issues. If we look into that, we will find out that it was up to a relatively small number of individuals who would take on this incredibly lavish production. Civic magistrates regularly signed civic issues, but in this case we do have magistrates or priests, in some cases is the Asiarch, for in the case of Laodicea, for example, or the Strategos at Pergamon, who I believe would have certainly dealt with the imperial entourage in trying to negotiate how the visit would have been celebrated and commemorated.
Fantastic. We have Luca asked again, could the issues with a portrait of Caracalla held by civic gods, for as in example in Tarsus, could this imply that a statue of the emperor was put in the temple in Tarsus? I wonder if the issue in question wants to stress this epiphany in the city.
Yes, absolutely. The connection with the festivals that I mentioned before, and this goes back more into my current project at Warwick, is that during processions, images of the emperors were taken from the temple and carried out alongside images of the gods. And whereas in some cases this might have been small statues in full figure, we also have evidence of busts being simply taken out and displayed. So for the format that we see in these coins, it can definitely be the case of a portable image. The size again can vary, and we cannot rely entirely on the scale presented on the coins, because that of course is up to the license of the artist, but could well be images stored in the temple and then displayed in public in great festival celebrations.
Fantastic. We're finally working our way through the questions, but Alia Tenu asks, he says, thank you for the excellent presentation. I think Caracalla visited Sardis as well. If he did, are there similar coins or medallions related to his imperial visit and his relationship to the traditional local gods or goddesses of Sardis?
Yes, there are, not to this extent, not so, let's say, groundbreaking in the way they use the imagery. But there are some examples which I have included in my paper, by the way. I think the scheme showing the emperor dealing directly with a god is something that we find at Sardi as well, and I cannot recall anything else that can be linked directly to this kind of imagery, but I might be forgetting something, I'm afraid. I wouldn't, but you can read my article and to find out.
I would definitely recommend reading the article. There's one final comment from David Taylor. He said, I'm not sure if it's a comment or question, but David suggests that Caracalla was in Mesopotamia for longer, but there's no similar coinage there, is there?
Well, that is a different, let's say, monetary tradition. In Mesopotamia, we have a different typology of coinage. We have, on the other hand, for instance, we have smaller denominations, and there is no great variety of coin types. There seems to be much less inventive, and definitely not particularly impacted by the presence of the emperor. But on the other hand, Caracalla is the emperor under whom the largest number of mints across the Levant produced silver tetradrachms. there is no influence on the imagery that might have affected that, but that is definitely an impact that his presence had to a different level within the Levant.
It's interesting, but can we safely conclude that Anatolia is maybe a little bit special, given that this is the Anatolian Studies seminar?
I think it's definitely, at least as with regards to coinage, is much more diverse, much more original, and somehow, yeah.
Excellent. It's good to have it confirmed. Anatolia is definitely special. Fantastic. I am going to call a close to our discussions this evening. They have been extremely varied, and I'm sorry for if you asked a question and you didn't feel it got quite as much time as you would have liked. If you would like to follow up with any of these queries or questions, please do email Dario or me. I'm not sure if I can help, but you're very welcome to email all the same. Susan Walker has already said in the chat that she'll be emailing you about an inscribed statue base recovered from Alexandria Harbour. So that sounds like there is some interesting discussions to continue after this seminar, which is fantastic. This is the last of our seminar. I know I've been saying it all evening, but it's the last of the seminars for the year. Please do have a look on our website. Charlotte has very kindly put this into the chat, the link. We will be updating it in the next few weeks with the seminar dates for next year. We are continuing. We have 3 more papers from the 2020 journal to present, and then we'll move on to the 2021 journal, which we shall be unveiling shortly. I'm very excited about that too. Or if you'd rather not keep checking the page online, you can just sign up to our email list, and we will spam you with lots of discussion about Anatolia and Anatolian archaeology, history and heritage. Thank you all very, very much, and we hope to see you in 2021. May 2021 be a different year from 2020, although we're glad that we have this, and we're glad that we have each other in this community in slightly difficult times. And we are very glad that we've had Dario with us for this final session.
Thank you, and thank you everyone again. It's been a pleasure, really. Okay. Very interesting questions. Yeah,
has been really good. Yep. Good evening, everybody. And we'll see you again. Heidi Guru.